Does it ever feel like the world is moving faster and faster and you struggle to keep up? Do you ever feel bombarded, even overwhelmed by all the cultural messages and noise? Ever wish you had just a little bit of biblical truth to help cut through the noise and bring some much needed clarity? Well, you've come to the right place. Hey everyone, welcome to the Weekly Disruption Podcast, a weekly dose of biblical truth to cut through the cultural noise. I'm your host, Chris Hemmelman, pastor of First City Church in Bellevue, Nebraska. This is our first episode, so if you are joining us at the beginning, thank you for helping us kick this off. And what I want to do in this first episode is talk about the genesis of this podcast and really why I wanted to do this. So every day we are bombarded by messages in our culture. These are narratives meant to shape our hearts and our minds with the ultimate goal of shaping our actions, our commitments, and our loyalty. Some of these messages we're very well aware of. We seek out information, we seek out knowledge in order to grow as people. Or we come across an idea that we disagree with, we say, "Not today, Satan," and we consciously reject it. But far more often, we are exposed to messages we're not even aware of. News media, social media, movies, music, TV, a barrage of information that we more passively engage. We don't really give it much thought and reflection. We think it goes in one ear and out the other, and we suppose that it's actually not forming us. But here's the truth. It is forming us. Here's a test for you. I want you to think of a controversial, debated topic. It could be something theological, like baptism or gifts of the Spirit, or whether women should be pastors or not. Or it could be something more cultural and political, abortion, immigration, homosexuality and transgender, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, why Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce dating is just a marketing scheme by the NFL. Whatever the issue may be, I want you to consider not only what you believe and think about it, but also what do you feel about it as well? What emotions get evoked inside of you anytime the topic comes up? Now consider how many of those topics you believe what you believe, think what you think, feel what you feel, because you took purposeful time to read and to think and to study and to discuss and come to a deep-seated conviction. And then how many of these issues did you arrive at your beliefs and your thoughts and your emotions more passively? You have thoughts, you have emotions, but you didn't actually sit down and study. My guess is that there are going to be a number of topics that you have a well-reasoned, well-thought-through, deep-seated conviction. And there are going to be other topics that you arrived at your beliefs and those emotions more passively. You didn't sit down and do any sort of deep study, and yet you still have thoughts. You still have emotions whenever those topics come up. Where did all of that come from? All those messages that you thought went in one ear and out the other? Not so much. But here's where this gets difficult for us. Our mass communication, mass information world just throws so much at us so fast. Facts and data and stories that not only can we be passively formed in a lot of ways, that when we do decide to stop and reflect and study, it gets confusing. How do we make sense of all this information? What's real? What's fake news? What's biblical? What's not? So many voices, so much noise that can feel very overwhelming. And here's what we can end up doing. We sort of retreat back into passivity and go with the flow, at least in most things. Yeah, we'll have our issues where we'll do some study and come to some deeply thought through convictions, but in most things, we are more or less passive. And here's why this is scary for us as Christians. Because what this means is that in most things, we're not being formed by God's word, but rather being passively formed by the voices in our culture. This approach leaves us under-discipled. Our passivity means that our views and therefore our actions and our commitments and our loyalties are less shaped by God's word and more shaped by the voices in our culture. And as our culture becomes more and more post-Christian, this will leave us, our families, and our churches spiritually unhealthy. As a pastor, I'm burdened by this. Burdened for my own church primarily, but also burdened for the church in the U.S. Jesus made us to be salt and light in our world. For us to be salty, like really salty, like McDonald's French fry level salty, we cannot be passive in our formation. We have to be purposeful and intentional to be formed by biblical truth and clarity. So that's why I started this podcast. You know, in my own teaching and preaching ministry, I roughly get about 35 to 40 minutes a week on a Sunday to preach God's word. And I absolutely believe in the supernatural formative power of preaching. But on a whole, that amount of time is like a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of noise our church is hit with on a weekly basis. So my hope is that this podcast will be just a moment in the week to sort of disrupt that noise and bring some biblical truth and clarity. And look, I understand that 15 to 20 minute podcasts once a week is also just a drop in the bucket, but I'm prayerful and I'm hopeful that it will bring some much needed biblical truth and clarity and encouragement and exhortation. Consider this podcast more of a starting point, a moment of clarity meant to redirect you and encourage you to further thought and formation. And it also may be that you disagree with me. That is absolutely fine. Everyone is entitled to be wrong once in a while. But in all seriousness, if you find yourself disagreeing, no worries. But allow what I say to spur you on to further thought and formation. Get into the Word and purposefully wrestle out your own convictions. Because to be clear, whether you agree with me or not, I do intend to provoke you. The title of this podcast is The Weekly Disruption for a reason. I want to disrupt the noise. I want to challenge cultural narratives and assumptions. I want to push back on the way the church has conceded beliefs and values to the culture. Now, I want to do this with love and with grace and with humor, but sometimes I'm going to throw some hot sauce on this mic. Things may be a little bit spicy at times, but I want to do so all for the purpose of biblical truth and clarity and for the good of the church. So, Lord willing, this podcast will serve to bring biblical clarity and disrupt some of the cultural noise. And we would love for you to support the work we're doing here at the Weekly Disruption Podcast. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button on our YouTube page, our iTunes page, and our Spotify. We would also love for you to get the word out, so feel free to pass this podcast along to anyone you think would benefit from the work that we're doing. I'd also love to interact with any of our listeners, so feel free to shoot me questions or comments or snide remarks, or if you have a great idea for a topic, feel free to email me at disruption@firstcitybellevue.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on the Weekly Disruption.